Is red on or is red off? Red is on, right? Red is off? Okay, so
Wait a second. Mark, your better side is the other side, so we're going to have to move the camera.
I need a haircut.
Mark, you have that stronger, your whole profile is a little stronger in reverse,
Okay.
so can we?
Yeah, I think I could switch with you, Mark.
All right, anyway, I'm just going to avoid looking at the TV monitor.
Yeah, really.
So welcome, everybody. This is whatever day it is now. The important thing is it's my daughter's first day of school, so she's not at home. We are here today to discuss the Joint Office of Homeless Services. This is a work session. One of the issues that's important, obviously, is the city's funding of the Joint Office of Homeless Services. We'll be hearing a little of the history, which is important for me as a relatively new member of the City Council, and perhaps for Commissioner Udaley as well, how the Joint Office of Homeless Services was formed, how the Joint Office of Homeless Services sets budget priorities, and what the outcomes of our various strategies are. We'll also be hearing about the city's overall financial context, our investments in homeless services funding, an overview of our general fund revenues and expenditures, and we'll be hearing a little bit about some of our future financial risks. This conversation sets the table for the council to have a discussion about the decisions that need to be made regarding the joint office budget and the timeline for those decisions to be made. And not to ruin everybody's September, but we're only a few short weeks away from starting the budget process for next year.
Okay, you ruined.
I did. I brought the whole house down. Thank you, Commissioner Fish, for your budget note to have this discussion early in the city's budget conversation. I don't know if you have some opening remarks you'd like to make as well.
I do, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to say that in a short amount of time, a tremendous amount of good work has been done. And one of the pieces of the history I look forward to reviewing with my colleagues today is the visionary work of Judy Clegg many years ago called the Clegg Report. And the idea that anticipating that we weren't going to have substantially more resources over time to tackle this incredibly important problem. And so we need to think about different ways of delivering services and coordinating services. And I think of the great work of former City Commissioner Gretchen Kafori, who often talked about that artificial divider between Resolution A and Resolution B on the county side, and what would happen if we actually coordinated better and functionally consolidated our services. Well, at the end of the day, Mayor, the people that we serve really don't care who provides the service. In fact, I think you and I probably have the same experience when we're doing grocery shopping. It's about libraries, it's about, it's an array of issues, and very rarely do they have anything to do with something over which we have control. The public expects a high level of services, and they expect different levels of government to work together to deliver it. I think we've made extraordinary progress in the next 2 years. Today we're going to talk about how far we've come and how we put it on a more stable path going forward. And then we're going to lay the groundwork for what I hope are some very exciting initiatives this fall about how we can make even a bigger dent in addressing homelessness in our community. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will have the chair of Multnomah County. Deborah's not here yet, is she? We will have the chair of Multnomah County, Deborah Kafori, with us today. As everybody can imagine, with the fire in the gorge, there's a lot going on, so she is probably dealing with that at this moment. I know there is a conference call at the moment. We're also going to hear from Shannon Callahan. We're going to hear from Mark Jolin, who is the director of the Joint Office of Homeless Services. And in the absence of Chair Kafori, why don't we start with Mark, were you going to go next, or did we want to have Shannon give her perspective? I see promise. It's getting more promising, and here she is.
That's quite an entrance.
Da, 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 da.
Very good.
I think we actually started a little ahead of schedule, so we're...
Can we do that again, by the way?
That was a great entry. Yeah, don't freak out, but turn around and check that out.
Okay.
So I was just giving sort of the broad introduction, Chair Kafori, and just mentioned that we're beginning our budget process, and that we're thrilled to have you here. And Shannon's going to give a little perspective from the city. You're going to give a little perspective from the county on the creation of the joint office. We're going to hear some budget issues. Mark's going to walk us through what looks to be a very good PowerPoint presentation. If you wouldn't mind, it'd be great to get your perspective on the founding of the joint office and the goals and the direction for the joint office from your perspective as the head of the county.
Thank you, and
Thank
thank
you.
you so
Thanks
much
for
for
being here.
having this meeting this morning, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be here. I'm sure you've heard the story before, but I will tell it again because I think it always bears repeating. When I started working at Multnomah County, it really struck me that our system for how we serve some of the most vulnerable people in our community was really broken. On the other side of the river at Multnomah County, we had the responsibility for homeless families. Over here on this side of the river, City of Portland had the responsibility for homeless individuals. But it never made any sense to me because if you're a mother looking for a place to stay for a night with your child, you really don't care who provides the service. You just want a safe place to sleep. So we pulled together city and county leaders, along with Home Forward, leaders in philanthropy, business community, homeless service providers, and consumers to form a home for everyone. By bringing so many voices together at the table, we were not guaranteed that we would all agree. And in fact, there were times where I felt that we spent way too much time in committees and talking about how to do things and not actually getting things done. But I admit, I'm proud to say at this point that by pulling everyone together, and I mean everyone, and by having some really tough conversations, we came to the conclusion that targeted investments in 3 key strategies could transform how we, as a community, address homelessness. Now, the plan is pretty straightforward. First, keep people from losing their homes in the first place by investing in prevention. Second, when we can't prevent someone's homelessness, we will try to get them directly into housing as quickly as possible using a wide range of housing placement strategies. And then, as a very last resort, create more emergency, immediate shelter places for people who need help tonight. Prevention, housing, shelter. So in response to this, the city and the county dug deep. We identified new resources to put on the table and expanded our services. Home Forward was a very important player in this game as well, targeting their resources toward our shared strategies. And we made a real difference. But we knew that we needed to do more. Our system was still split and fragmented, so we started talking again, city and the county, trying to figure out the best way to memorialize this partnership and actually improve the way that we serve people. So what emerged after many, many, many meetings, Shannon, I'm sure will retell in detail, was our next step to create a joint office of homeless services. And last month, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioner Udaley, and I heard about the results of this partnership. Last year, a record number of people were helped into permanent housing, nearly 4,900. 6,139 people received prevention services. That's nearly 2,000 more than the year before, and over 1,000 people above our goal. And 8,532 people found shelter in the network that we doubled capacity in. 2 years ago, that number was 4,760. So while we've done a lot, we are still just getting started. Today, our services are more aligned and more efficient, and I am really proud that we are here at this point talking about this partnership. And I want to be clear, this is not how government works everywhere. And we know that because other communities are coming to us, wanting to understand what we're doing here and how they can do what we're doing here, there. And this is a testament to who we are as a community. The people of our county and our city have a deep compassion to help other people, but they also expect us to get things done. And I've been working on housing long enough to tell you that that is happening now because we're all pulling in the same direction. I'm happy to have any questions that you might have, but I'm also happy to hand it over to Shannon and Mark and the other people around the table who have been immediately and intricately involved in this. I want to say thank you. I know that when we started talking about this years ago, and as each step of the way, there have been naysayers, and there's been people who are just kind of along for the ride, and there's also been people who were doubtful that we would ever get this far. I would say now is definitely not the time to turn back. Now is the time to keep pushing ahead and to address the next chapter in our efforts to address homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Kafori, for being here. Did anybody have any comments or thoughts, questions? We appreciate that very much. And Shannon, you were obviously here and instrumental from the city's perspective when you worked with Commissioner Salzer. You could give us your perspective. Thank you.
As mentioned by Chair Kafori, the formation of the joint office came from an unprecedented level of collaboration between the city, county, and other partners. Although the staffs of both governments had coordinated for many years, there were still two contracting systems, two different offices, and just in general, two different systems. And with this discussion, I don't want to put aside the fact that this concept had been on the table and discussed for many housers who've talked to me for, I think, more than 20 years, but was never the right time to happen for a variety of different reasons, which I'm truly not privy to, but I do know that this was the right time. So in 2015, the executive director of the Home for Everyone initiative at the time, Mark Jolin, proposed a variety of different structures and hosts for the lead agency for a cross-jurisdictional partnership. A group of the city, county, and Home Forward got together to review those lead agency options. At the time, we considered 4 different host locations: the city itself, the county itself, Home Forward as a neutral partner, and then even a new nonprofit host. After looking through all of those options and the strengths and weaknesses of those options, there was consensus that the county would be the best host entity, as it had key systems and services that impacted people experiencing homelessness, including healthcare, mental health care, alcohol and drug treatment programs. The group believed that better alignment with these services would better improve outcomes for the people that we were intending to serve. The city and county elected officials concurred in this recommendation and directed staff to work on a new lead agency hosted at the county. In early 2016, the city and county formed a joint steering committee, bringing together cross-governmental teams in logistics, contracts and programming, communications, HR and labor relations, legal and budget and finance, to bring forward an IGA to the city and county for approval in June of 2016. City Council and County Commission unanimously passed that IGA, and the joint office started about a week and a half later, on July 1st of 2016. So that's a kind of a condensed history, but one of the key takeaways I think from this is that the county was not the only option that was considered, but at the time was the best option agreed to by all the parties. And with that, unless you have any questions, I would turn it over to Mark.
Can I make one comment on that? And
That's
it's on. It's on if it's not red.
No, I think on is red.
yeah, red is
Red is
On, that's,
yeah.
okay, all right. Because part of the purpose of this work session is to share some history with the new council, I want to just make the following observation. When I was elected in 2008, one of the first projects I worked on over the next 2 years was with then Mayor Adams in bringing all the housing services and dollars under one roof. It was a recommendation that was had been contained in Judy Clegg's report of years before in terms of better delivering services to deserving people in our community. It was an option that was within our reach, and it turned out to be excruciatingly difficult for many, many reasons. The net effect was PDC was liberated to do what it did best, which was economic development, and the Housing Bureau was relentlessly focused on the needs of low-income people. When this next piece of what I'll call the continuing work of consolidating and coordinating and collapsing systems came up, I want to be honest, I had initially a very negative reaction. And I did so because at the time I felt the Ending Homelessness team was among the highest performing units of the Portland Housing Bureau. And so, Mayor, you've run bureaus at the state, county, city level. Chair Kafori has a strong mayor form of government. She runs all the executive agencies. So you're looking at a high-performing entity, and you're taking a piece of it that has historically been among the highest performers, getting great results. And I had some real trepidation. Number one, I was concerned about the impact on morale and the workers themselves. And so I had to be convinced by Sally and Ryan and everybody that they were on board. Number two, I thought that there was a risk that we were taking a big values piece out of the Housing Bureau. In every agency, there is a component that reminds us every day about why we do what we do. And I thought the Ending Homeless team really came as close to anybody within the Housing Bureau that stated our most important values around why, and who. But what ultimately brought me to the view that Dan and others who were leading the effort had was I saw the merit in further consolidating all these services under one roof. Chair Kafori mentioned that there had been a fragmented system. She has on her side of the river lots of services and programs that are important. We have on our side. The promise was if we put them under one roof on one side of the river, we could get even better results and more accountability. And so I reluctantly agreed to this. I still think there has been a lingering cost to the Housing Bureau on the values side, but what I have also seen is a multiplier effect of having all this talent under one roof in a chair's office. And the thing I want to also remind my colleagues is this is a joint office. This was not the city shedding itself of homelessness services. This was the city and the county saying we're going to put them under one roof, but we're going to continue jointly to fund and lead. And so I appreciate all the hard work that went into it. It took an extra effort for me to get there, but as I look back, I think it was the right decision.
All right. Well, thank you first for giving me the opportunity to be here. It's actually been an incredible honor to be able to be the director of this office for the last year, primarily because of the team, as Commissioner Fish mentioned, that came together to create this office and has been working incredibly hard for the last year to deliver on the promises that have been made as best we can. And I know all of us are committed to continuing to see progress with this office because everybody in that office is deeply and passionately committed to meeting the needs of folks who are experiencing homelessness in our community. So with that, I do want to go through our PowerPoint here, and please feel free. Now I'm looking to the technology folks to help me out. There we go. So you've heard a little bit about the origins of the office from the chair and from Shannon. As much work as it was going to take, and Commissioner Fish is right that the discussion is long-standing in our community. There's actually an city auditor's report from 2009 that documents that the auditor as early as 1997 was saying that our system of housing and homeless services was too fragmented. The Clegg report in 2008. And yet the work of trying to bring these two groups together in a joint office was significant. So there needed to be a clear statement of purpose and a clear statement of what the benefits would be from creating this office. Those benefits, first and foremost, to deepen the collaboration between the city and the county, but also to strengthen the collaboration that exists within a Home for Everyone beyond the county with Home Forward, with our nonprofit partners, with the faith and business communities. Then, as the chair said, to remove the silos, these historic silos that had led to inconsistent contracting and data processes, separate planning processes for different populations that had many of the same needs. To improve alignment, and here really Shannon spoke to this. There is an unprecedented opportunity with the creation of the joint office for those who do homeless services work and plan for homeless services work to turn outward, to look for partnerships. Within the county, those are partnerships with Department of Community Justice, with Department of Health, and we've already seen some pilot projects launched with those two entities. To deepen and strengthen the relationship with the Portland Housing Bureau, of course, on the housing development side and also on their tenant protection side, but to look for partnerships with the other bureaus within the city of Portland, with the Parks Department, with OMF, to better align our social services with our public space management and public safety organizations. The Police Bureau, of course, also on that list. Creating the joint office gives us an opportunity to improve the system planning, performance measurement, and transparency. When you have two different jurisdictions trying to run related services in inconsistent ways, you lose some of the transparency in the system. How are decisions being made? How are we budgeting? How are we prioritizing? You also run the risk of having inconsistent measurements across those two systems. Data collection practices are not the same. Outcome reporting is not necessarily the same. Creating the joint office allows us to ensure that everyone who's receiving city or county general fund is adhering to the same set of standards, outcome measures, data practices, allows us to, and you'll see this in a moment, much better report on system level outcomes for the community as a whole. And then finally, improving efficiency. We have limited staff resources in our community that go towards homeless services, a very small number of staff on the city and the county side. Bring them together in one place allows us to better utilize those staff resources in a more effective way. Again, it also allows us to ensure that our nonprofits are being asked to do the same things regardless of the service that they're providing in terms of what the contract requirements are, what the data reporting methods are, what the outcomes are that they're being asked to report on. So prior to the joint office, the city and the county did not always have, although the same contractor might have contracts with both agencies or both jurisdictions, those contracts would look different. Different in terms of what data was to be collected, how data was to be reported. We're able, with the joint office, to reconcile those things. We've done a lot of that this year. We'll continue to do it. The contracts are coming into alignment now, and you'll see some examples of that in a moment. And we've also, importantly this year, created uniform expectations of our contractors around equity assessments within their organizations and progress reporting on racial equity. So Shannon mentioned the joint office was created through an intentional and very detailed planning process that resulted in an intergovernmental agreement that is many pages long and very comprehensive. And this slide just gives you a broad overview of what's covered in that IGA. It's a 5-year IGA, renewable. It spells out in great detail the process for consolidating the staff and contracts. The staff consolidation part was really important to make sure that staff who were coming over maintained all of their benefits. Those conversations, of course, involved the unions as well. The reporting responsibility of the joint office makes it clear that the director is appointed by the chair in consultation with the housing commissioner, that the director of the office reports directly to the chair, but is also responsible to the housing commissioner. And then I'm responsible for continuing to brief both the City Council and the County Commission on homeless services related issues. Importantly, to ensure ongoing coordination and alignment, this is a joint office. The IGA creates the Policy, Budget, and Alignment Committee, the PBAC. That committee is made up of a lead policy staff person from the Housing Commissioner, lead policy staff person on homelessness issues for the chair, as well as the director of the Portland Housing Bureau and the director of the Department of County Human Services, and an additional member who is the director of Home Forward, Michael Bonacore. That group meets quarterly, and the job of that group is to ensure that the work of the joint office is being aligned with the priorities of the city and the county. Mayor, did you have a question?
Nope.
Nope. Okay, just saw your light come on. So then the IGA outlines the key functions of the office. Some of those have been discussed here. We oversee and implement the Home for Everyone planning process on behalf of the community. We contract. 96% of our resources are contracted out to nonprofits to do the work of ending homelessness in our community. And then we are also the lead agency for purposes of the Multnomah County, City of Portland, Gresham Continuum of Care. That is the federal grant that is annually applied for and renewed. It's about $22 million, I think, at this point. Most of those dollars don't flow through the office, but the office is responsible for submitting the application and monitoring performance in
I ask a
partnership with
question?
PHB. Yes.
This is of the chair. You know, as I look at the reporting requirement, I realize that what we created here is one of the most challenging positions in government. Mark is appointed by you, although you consult with the housing commissioner, reports to you, but advises the council and the commission. And it's why every once in a while Mark looks a little ragged as he's.
I was just thinking about that. His a lot of bags under
Yeah,
his
as-
eyes. He's getting.
He looks a little ragged sometimes as he's racing back and forth across the river. But did we get the reporting piece of this right?
You know, it's been a year. I'm kind of struck. I think we should all pause for a second. July 2017, you started, 2016. That's pretty amazing when you look back, especially after we'll see the numbers for all that we've done as a community in this past year. So I think it's too early to tell. It's working well so far, but we will see now. This is our first transition with having a new mayor and some new commissioners on both sides. And so I think this is really our opportunity to see what is working and what needs to be changed. I think everything's working great, but, you know.
I'm just curious as a practical matter. Do you maintain an office in this building as well as the county? Do you have a cubicle in the mayor's office if you need to be on this side of the river?
I don't have a cubicle, but I am able to walk into the housing commissioner mayor's office freely and am there probably 4 or 5 times a week.
I'll talk to security about that, Commissioner Fish.
Well, I think it would be great if there was a spare cubicle, just as a place that people
Yeah.
knew they could leave stuff or leave a message or whatever.
The
Yeah.
joint offices are actually on this side of the river, so he's
So I-
being a staffer over in the Lincoln Building.
Yeah.
Right.
His office is actually much nicer than
Yeah,
ours.
once the joint office was formed, the whole team is at the Lincoln Building.
Right.
So I come to the 6th floor as
Okay.
needed, to the mayor's office as needed, and
But you get
in
what you
both
need.
places.
When you're
Yes.
here,
Oh,
you get what you
absolutely. Absolutely. I feel entirely welcome and supported. And I have to say, it is challenging, and I think it's the essence of this work, right? That we have this kind of shared reporting, this kind of ongoing collaboration, not just at the political level, but at the staff level. And so, you know, it's a great job, it's a challenging job, but it's not just me. We've got folks across the offices who are making sure that this collaboration can happen.
And if I could just add to that, in all seriousness, Mark has been extremely accessible, and he is a regular in our office, and we're always happy to see him.
Thank you. So coming back to the presentation, will it come back up? So then outcome reporting, this is really a significant part of the IGA to make it very clear that the joint office is expected to report on a quarterly and annual basis on key performance measures to the PBAC and also to the Housing Bureau. I'll talk a little bit more about those outcomes in a moment. And how we also are responsible to the Home for Everyone Executive Committee and Coordinating Board. And with that, I want to acknowledge Commissioner Myron, who's here. She is our second county designee on the Executive Committee, and Commissioner Udaley is the second City Council member on our Executive Committee. Then the funding. This is, of course, a big part of the IGA. There's a lot of money coming from the City of Portland over to the joint office on an annual basis. I will have a slide that shows how that sort of financial accountability plays out, but this is a significant piece in the IGA. And then finally, making it very clear that the city retains the authority to come in and audit and investigate and monitor all of the activities of the joint office.
Well, that's interesting you say that. So, I mean, the mayor and I had an experience recently about wanting to have an entity audited, and ultimately it is at the discretion of the auditor. So does this contemplate that we would ask the auditor to perform that function, or could it also be some third party?
That is a question I don't know the answer to.
It's a theoretical, but just to be clear, the auditor does not work for the council. I mean, she's an independently elected person. We can kibitz, but she decides. I'm assuming that if her card was full and we felt like there was a need for an audit, we could arrange either to buy the service or to go to a third party. And
That would be
Andrew
my
seems to be
assumption.
nodding.
Shannon, do you?
I think either was contemplated, but this language was actually requested by the auditor's office so that they could initiate audits, whether through their office or through an independent means, so.
So then let's look at the outcome accountability. So these are really the system performance measures. The IGA requires that we quarterly report specific system performance measures. They're listed here, and if you've been to joint briefings, you've seen these. If you've been to the executive committee meeting, you've seen some of these system level outcomes reported on. So we're still working. As I said, one of the advantages of creating the joint office was to get real alignment around data, both how data goes into the system and how we're able to pull data out, regardless of whether the provider is serving singles, families, youth. That is not alignment that we've historically had. The Housing Bureau, with the launch of A Home for Everyone, initiated a couple of really important subcommittees that have continued to meet almost monthly for the last 2 years to move that data alignment conversation forward. So to be clear, that's not just joint office work. We're continuing the work that had already begun. So in the last 2 years, we've created these system performance measures. We've created consistent workflow across providers in terms of data entry, and we've worked hard to improve our ability to get consistent data out of the system. It's not perfect yet by any means, but that has been really critical work that we're carrying on. We've also moved to an open data system so that going forward with the appropriate protections in place, as people come into our various providers and systems of care, their information is able to be shared across providers so that we're better able to coordinate services for each individual. That was a very important move for us to make. It's also allowed us to make progress on coordinated access. So as coordinated access has existed in the family system and the domestic violence system and youth systems, we're now in the process of implementing it on the singles side with respect to permanent supportive housing. And what that essentially means is that whoever is engaging with someone who is seeking services is using the same assessment method, it's going into the same database, and they're being prioritized for services with all of the other folks, regardless of which door they entered into, to make sure that people are being matched with the most appropriate service.
Mark, with regard to performance and outcomes in the data that you mentioned up there, where can the council go, where can the public go to get that information?
So our quarterly dashboard reports are on ahomeforeveryone.net. So all of that data is available to anyone who wants to see it. It is presented to the coordinating board on a quarterly basis in great detail. It's also presented to the executive committee. So that data is readily available.
Could you say the website one more time, please?
Ahomeforeveryone.net.
Very good. Shameless advertising.
Absolutely.
Wanted
Happy
get that out
to
there.
do
Thank
it.
you.
Yes. So the other progress we've been able to make here is that in the first year of the joint office, with the support of the city and the county, we were able to hire a professional evaluation firm to develop with us an evaluation framework for the Home for Everyone initiative as a whole, to identify the key questions that we needed to be able to answer going forward. We're now working with the county's evaluation team to begin the implementation of that evaluation process. So the other place where there is accountability is at the contractor level, and I'm going to show you a little bit of just sort of what it looks like inside of a contract to have an understanding. But when we set goals for ourselves as a community around the number of placements we want to achieve, who we want to serve, and how, that translates into very specific contract level expectations of our providers. So here are some of the actual system outcomes. And again, for our executive committee members, you've seen these, and the chair just shared some of them. This is only at the highest level. And these outcomes are tied specifically into those high-level goals that we've set within A Home for Everyone for ourselves, the system expansion goals that you've all heard about before. What this gives you is a sense of our evolution from fiscal year 2014 to fiscal year 2017 in terms of placements into permanent housing, preventions, and then shelter access. What you'll see is that we started in 2014 with just under 3,000 placements a year, which was good, and we made a commitment at that time with A Home for Everyone that we were going to expand the number of people we were serving up to initially 4,350 people by the second year. We're in, through that second year, we actually far exceeded that and ended up at 4,885 people placed into permanent housing in a single year. For context, we reported about 12,000 placements total under the first 10-year plan to end homelessness.
So let me ask you a couple of questions. First of all, this sort of is a meld between this slide and the prior one on the contracting side. How many contracts do we currently manage through the joint office?
I believe we have 45 contracts.
45. And is there any effort, or is it advisable to try and streamline the number of contracts? That seems like a large number of contracts for your office to be managing.
So we have been able to actually reduce the number of contracts through the creation of the joint office because, as I mentioned, some providers had contracts both with the city, PHB, and with Multnomah County. So the initial cut at consolidation is to reduce that. So Cascadia only has one contract anymore, for example, with us. That said, we're obviously looking at not so much how many contracts we have, but do we have the right mix of providers that we're contracting with for the right range of services? So I think, we understand that we need to have as many contracts in place as it's going to take to implement the strategies that we've identified as the key strategies. So, for example, we added culturally specific service providers into our contracting mix over the last several years, recognizing that we needed to expand services to African Americans in particular, and didn't have, and this was a PHB decision initially, a relationship with the Urban League, for example, at the time. So as we look at what kinds of services we want to offer, we will either expand or reduce the number of contracts we have.
And I realize this is a very complicated aspect related to the budgeting, but obviously as you increase the number of contracts, you run the potential risk of increasing the overhead that you're funding rather than direct services. And so there has to obviously be a give and take, and it would be helpful to have an understanding of what that overhead carry is as far as the budgeting we're doing. From my perspective, and I know we've talked about this before, but I just want to get it on the record with my colleagues, it would be helpful to have a clearer understanding on a contract by contract basis and overall performance and outcome standards for those contracts, because then that would help us determine whether or not we should be building for scale, or alternatively, and you just gave a great example of where it makes sense to actually contract out with a specific provider. And so from my perspective as I budget, it would be very helpful to have that performance and outcome metric built into the system.
So I can't give you the total, but I'm looking across to Christian, because the county actually has a maximum amount that any provider can take as admin. So it's a percentage of a total, and I believe is it 10%?
We're at, I think it's between 8 and 10%, depending on the service lines.
Okay. So, but we can get you the total amount, but there is
but
control
you see my
in place.
point.
I do, absolutely.
If you have two and you have 8 to 10% versus one that you scale up, that's, there's a difference there in the overall percentage going towards overhead.
Sure. So, and we can actually run that and get you a report back on what
And then
I just also add
sorry,
real
Chair.
quick, I
Sure.
think we also have to be careful, and I'm sure you have similar rules at the city, around having nonprofits who are carried too much by the funding from one particular organization. So it is a delicate balance where while we do want to look at overhead, we also don't want a nonprofit to be solely dependent on a huge chunk of change just from this office.
Right, and we lived through the Cascadia version 1 together, so I'm still a little PTSD about that. Related to the last slide you had up there, I believe it's slide 8, and it shows what we all around this table know, which is that we're increasing our commitment to the joint office. I know Andrew will correct me later because he's very good with numbers, but I think over the last 5 years, the city has increased its general fund outlay by 165%, and just in the last year, ongoing general fund outlays were increased by 77%. And so as I look at the system outcomes, it's obvious that we're carrying more people into housing, and we're investing more in prevention. We're investing a lot more in shelter than we were previously. But as you know, there's a spigot. And if we could shut off that spigot, I think we'd be able to declare success or something close to it in terms of having addressed the issue here in the city of Portland and in Multnomah County on a larger scale. but unfortunately, we still have that inflow. And the concern that you and I have talked about, and one that I've certainly expressed, is if we can't shut off the inflow, we could continue to put more and more resources into the joint office and maybe not actually see much of a difference in terms of what's happening on the street. So what can you tell us about the inflow, and what does the last point in time count tell us about the inflow?
Well, so what I can tell you about the inflow is a couple of things. One is that prevention is, our commitment to kind of increasing our prevention investments in part reflects what you've just said, right? It's a recognition that even as we have people on the street who have current need, that ultimately better for the people themselves and more cost effective if we can properly identify those folks who, but for prevention investment, would become homeless and need shelter or be sleeping outside. And so with this expansion of resources this past year, we've made significant investments in new efforts around prevention. We have a new program with Central City Concern that specifically works with folks coming out of incarceration, African Americans in particular, to help ensure that they don't wind up homeless and instead are getting housing, treatment, and employment services that they need then. We've put a lot more resources towards shelter diversion so that as people are calling, asking for shelter, they're having a conversation about, is there something we could do financially to assist you in staying in the housing that you're currently in? We've got alignment between our workforce investments and our housing investments to help ensure that people who are in the process of job training don't lose their housing in the midst of that and wind up unable to complete their job training. So the commitment is there to increase that, and it's a part of our system that we historically didn't fund at all, and so we're moving increasingly towards that and trying to do it well. All of those are trying to reduce, right, that inflow. The tenant protection work that the city is doing and the county is doing, that helps to go to that. And we know that with housing costs as they are, we have folks coming out of hospital settings, out of mental health hospital settings. We have folks coming out of foster care, out of the criminal justice system, all of whom are more likely than most to end up experiencing homelessness. So we can, with our homeless response systems, push resources towards prevention, and then we need to continue to form those partnerships that I'm describing with other parts of the system, other institutions that are contributing to the number of people who are becoming homeless in our community. So that's all there. It's all work that's happening for the very reason you say. And then to answer your last question, the point in time count doesn't necessarily tell us an inflow number, but because we saw homelessness continue to go up about 11% over a 2-year period, and we also know that we were moving a lot of folks into permanent housing, that the inflow continued to exceed our ability to place. And that's just the hydraulics we've talked about, right? If we're housing more people, doing more preventions, and still the number is going up, it means that more folks are falling into homelessness than we were able to help.
So if I may just ask one question, how do we know, or do we know, if we should be putting a lot more resource on the front end, on the prevention side, versus the back end?
Well, I think as we move forward over time, and again,
Because
this is
draining the tub is a lot more expensive than preventing it from being filled, right?
right. And I think we're just on the front end of this initiative in terms of the planning effort, and we've both said we need to do more on the prevention end, and that's very difficult work to get right. For a long period of time, even the federal government was getting out of the prevention role, because when they did their analysis of folks who came seeking prevention assistance and got it versus those who came seeking and didn't, and then checked in later to see whether it made a difference in terms of rates of homelessness, it didn't. Not because some of those folks didn't need prevention assistance, but because the mechanisms for figuring out who did it and didn't really need it in order to avoid homelessness, those weren't in place. And so as I describe these pilot projects, what we're trying to do with each of them is get to a place where we can more reliably identify those households for whom, but for the prevention investment, they would become homeless.
So we have this committee, the Home for Everyone Data Outcomes and Evaluation Committee. Could that committee be used for the purpose of honing in on some of these strategies?
So those Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes, and in particular on the evaluation side, we can both generate data locally on what prevention strategies are working and also look nationally because every community is facing the same set of conversations. How do we, with limited resources, do a better job of identifying those households who are going to wind up in our shelters if we don't make a prevention investment? So what you're seeing us pilot are the kinds of things we know from other places have been more effective at sorting out those folks who need that intervention. And to be clear,
But that committee hasn't met very often, has it?
the
does.
data
How often
in and
does it
data
meet?
out committee is scheduled to meet monthly. I don't know that they've managed to meet every month, but I'm sure they're meeting every other month. I'm
Okay, but
looking at.
we could use that as a resource for this effort.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Good,
And
good.
more broadly, the evaluation, evaluation team at Multnomah County, who's also been participating there on a regular basis. And we're in the process of hiring a data analyst person as well in our office, so we'll
Great.
have more capacity to do that.
One of the benefits of having this joint office and having this, everything compiled in one area is we are able to better utilize the current county and city resources that are going in other directions. And I think Mark briefly touched on this, but we now have our folks in DCJ talking about homelessness. We now have people in our health department talking about homelessness, so that when, we're, as Mark talked about with our project with Central City, people who are getting out of the criminal justice system get into housing, and then if they relapse, or we help them keep their housing while they're somewhere else getting treatment, or while they're in their hospital stay, help them keep their housing so that they don't churn in and out, in and out, in and out. So there's a lot of those kind of efforts that are going on as well, and I think those efforts are happening today because of this.
That's great, and I think
team.
they're very important.
And it's reflected in the data, right? So moving from 4,000 to 6,000 preventions in a year reflects that set of commitments and the recognition that those strategies matter a lot and can be successful if we do them well.
Mark, one of the challenges we have is in devising a way to measure success that is consistent with public perception.
Mm-hmm.
Government often gets itself in real hot water when it declares we're making all this progress and success, but it's completely contrary to people's life experience. And a challenge we have today is that homelessness is more visible in our community. And we could spend an entire work session talking about how we got to this situation. But it means it's more challenging to communicate to people the success about the progress we're making. And frankly, the prevention stuff is doubly hard to talk about, because you're saying, boy, we did a wonderful thing. We prevented something bad from happening. Well, we understand that in the context of the Fire Bureau, but it's a little harder when you're talking about, the parade of horribles that didn't flow because we gave someone $300 and they didn't get evicted. So with that in mind, I want to ask you two questions. This data is very impressive, obviously. The slide that we had up a moment ago, the system-level outcomes. And, we've made a huge commitment to shelter access, not my favorite piece of the housing continuum, but on the theory that it is a better place than someone on the street, and hopefully it is a way station to a better place. You're to be applauded. And these numbers tell a very important story. But I think it's still challenging to tell this story to a public that sees tense and a significant rise in chronically homeless people on the streets, as the point in time count demonstrated. Almost 2/3 of the people surveyed saying they have a significant drug and alcohol and mental health challenge. So those are the folks that really draw attention. And whether you live in Portland or you're visiting Portland, it causes you to reflect upon what kind of decent society allows someone in that condition to live outside. So how do we measure success? Now, one way someone is going to do it is they're going to take the amount that we allocate annually to the joint office. They're going to sort of divide by this data, and they're going to come up with some rough measure. Now, I don't particularly find that helpful as a way of doing it, but what's your thought on that approach?
It's a piece of relevant information. I think it requires some context. So importantly, the baseline outcomes that we went into this effort with, the FY14, outcomes were being achieved by the then existing investments coming not just from the city and the county, but also from Forward and the federal government and other partners that brought resources to the table. Not all of those partners have expanded their investments at the same rate that the city and the county did. Home Forward has come to the table with a significant amount of additional resource in these efforts, but the city and county dollars are having to cover more of the per person total expense for each placement or prevention than those baselines did. And so if you just do the math that you just described, it will appear that we're not getting the same number of additional placements per dollar that we were to start with. That's not necessarily the case. It's a function of how the resources there were being shared, right? And the other is that the costs have risen in our community. There is no way around the fact that ending homelessness is about providing housing for folks. Housing has gotten a lot more expensive. Every year, high single digit, sometimes double digit rent increases. Those significantly impact our ability with the same amount of money to house the same a number of people, right? And so as we expand the resources, the amount we can buy in terms of housing placement or retention for those resources goes down as the costs of those things go up.
So I encourage you to think about how to tell that story annually, because again, the default for some people is just to take the numbers, divide by the dollars, and then make a gross generalization. And it wasn't that long ago that a number of very fine journalists in Portland wrote stories on sort of the 10-year plan to end homelessness. Now, if we could all go back in time, we'd plead with President Bush not to call it the 10-year plan to end homelessness. It was a requirement of getting the federal money. It was a self-defeating brand, and it wasn't even as it was advertised. It was a 10-year plan to make a hell of a dent on chronic homelessness, but not homelessness more generally. Public obviously didn't understand that distinction. Why should they? I was struck by one of the more thoughtful postmortems, where, of course, the entire story was framed around failure, because there was still homelessness. And I thought, boy, what other institution do we apply the same standard? I mean, should religion be held to a failure standard because they're still sinners?
What about hospitals? There's still sick people.
We still have sick people. Yeah. Has America, as a great experiment in democracy, failed because we still have poverty? I mean, at what point does that just become a meaningless benchmark? There was an intervention done on one of those stories, and as an accommodation, the newspaper ran a box online, but not in the print edition, that noted that about 12,000 people had been moved from the streets to homes. New systems had been pioneered, and an entire system had been revitalized. But that wasn't relevant to the way people wanted to look at the 10-year plan, because we hadn't ended homelessness. There was still homelessness. And therefore, so I'm going to encourage you, as you show this kind of progress, which I know is hard and laudable, let's make sure we're defining success clearly and then bringing the public along so they understand that even with people outside and other signs of distress in our system, we can celebrate success because these dollars are actually getting the kind of outcomes we want. And to Ted's point about the spigot, every time I hear the spigot, I think of the movie Fantasia and my favorite scene as a kid. That scene in the basement with all the water cascading down, and the bucket brigade is trying to furiously keep up.
That's your favorite scene, Commissioner?
Well, isn't that the
nightmare scene?
It's the one I'm probably most haunted by. But
tells us a lot.
But this yeoman's work to keep getting the water out of the basement. Well, to use the metaphor that Ted started,
I regret it now.
We don't control the source of that water. We don't send young men and women off to war. We don't junk the economy through risky investments. We don't put $40 billion in affordable housing and over $200 billion into housing for people that already have something. We don't make those choices, but we are inevitably charged with addressing the human toll that is caused by those decisions. And in that sense, Mayor, I've just reconciled that we don't control the spigot. We never have. It goes back to Bud Clark's 11-point plan, and just acknowledging that the supply is beyond our means. The solutions are uniquely within our reach. And we have to continue to make the case to the public that even if we didn't cause most of the problem, we have a moral obligation to be part of the solution.
Director Joel and I have a few questions, just trying to get at the true scope of the problem that we're dealing with. So on slide 8, in 2017, it shows we assisted roughly 20,000 people either through placement, prevention, or shelter access. Do you have a sense of the actual number as far as unique individuals? Because I'm assuming there's crossover between shelter and placement, for instance.
So I'm looking at Ryan. So generally, in terms of preventions and placements, we're deduplicating. Are we also deduplicating in terms of folks served? We're not double counting people in shelter. So that's 8,000 unique individuals who went through shelter. Whether some of those folks went into shelter and later into permanent housing, they would then show up in both counts.
Okay.
I don't know what that
So we don't
number
have a clear
is
number.
exactly. Okay.
Okay. Do we have a sense of who we're not touching? Like how many people are out there who are technically homeless and not receiving services?
Well, we know from the point in time count how many folks on a given night are outside, right? So it's 1,600 who are entirely unsheltered. Doesn't mean they're not receiving any services, because many of them may well be engaged with our outreach teams that are providing basic survival services and also doing the work of getting them into housing. But sort of on a per night basis, that's the best estimate we have of folks who don't even have the sort of basic safety of shelter at that moment.
And there's been this number floating around out there of people who are doubling up with friends and family. Where does that number come from?
So it's pretty imperfect data that we have available to us. We can look to the schools data, which of course will only capture school-aged kids or households with school-aged kids. We can look at some data from the TANF benefit program and food stamp program, where there's some reporting on housing status. In general, the best estimate is that it's probably 3 to 4 times the number of HUD homeless are doubled up on any given night. That's the 2015 point in time count did a fairly thorough analysis of the best available data at that time.
And that's the 16,000
Right.
number.
Yeah.
We also hear about half of our renters being cost burden and half of those renters being severely cost burden. Where are those numbers coming from?
I assume that data is coming out of the American Community Survey, which does a periodic report on levels of cost burden renters. There may be other sources for that as well.
So that's a national average, not
No,
Oregon
that's
or-
localized.
Oh,
That's
okay.
localized. That's done by the National Low Income Housing Coalition does a report that breaks it out by
Oh, okay.
community every year. And I'm looking at Director Krieger to make sure I'm not missing a data source here.
All correct. I would like to say that the couch surfing number is also cross-checked by the Americans Community Survey, which reports overcrowding. So we have multiple data sets on overcrowding, not just, and they are local. We have a very robust HMIS, Homeless Management Information Team at the PHB, which interfaces with the Joint Office.
Thank you. So, just a little review. We assisted around 20,000 people last year.
We actually assisted, there's another slide, a couple
Okay.
up, but it was about 29,000 people.
29,000
who received some form of assistance, including retention services. It's not all captured in those 3 bars, but folks who
Yeah.
received other types of services that were also sort of in response to their housing situation. So it's 29,000, and to be clear, Ryan just clarified for me, those are deduplicated.
Yeah.
So when we report the total number served, if they both had shelter experience and housing placement, we didn't count them twice
Okay.
in generating the total number served. So you had 29,000 unique individuals who
Okay.
received services.
Another 1,600 who are unsheltered on the street, 16,000 who are doubling up with friends and family, and about 80,000 people spending more than half of their income on housing, and I would consider high risk for displacement and homelessness.
And that's true on any given night, all right?
Yeah.
It's probably somewhere in the 12,000 doubled up. It's the 1,600 outside, the just under 4,000 total who are HUD homeless, and then the 12 on top who are doubled up. So yes, the unmet need is enormous.
So, I mean, as you know, I've been somewhat focused on the prevention side, strengthening tenant protections, keeping people in the housing that they're already in. And so I want to pitch an idea to you,
Okay.
the group, which is that we do some kind of feasibility study on providing legal aid for people who are being evicted. It's happening in other cities. I think it's proven to be a cost-effective method of keeping people in housing. Our eviction court is called an eviction mill for good reasons. There's a real power imbalance and resource imbalance between landlords and tenants, and I think that's something that we need to look at.
So it would be essentially any income eligible person would be entitled to legal representation in their particular case, something like New York is doing. Yeah, that's not something we've ever tried to sort of cost out or program out that I'm aware of. There are resources going to legal services, more of them, but not at that scale, I don't think.
And Commissioner, in the current year budget, the Housing Bureau is sweeping the data at the court level system. And we're hoping to report that in October with the state of housing in Portland, so you start to see the contours at least of what's going on. It is troubling that without representation, many people are essentially don't show, which then is a judgment, which then bars them from future housing by most landlords. So there's a social cost connected to the eviction process.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So, folks, I want to make sure we
Yep.
get to the financial piece
Yep.
of this as well. So let's let Mark get through his
Can we
his
bring
presentation.
the slides back up, and I'll move through them quickly. There they are. So here is the shelter bed. Remember that we were less focused on how many people would be served, but more on the number of beds available. So we set a 650 target. We've more than done 650 year-round shelter beds in the last 2 years, and we've added a number of temporary shelter beds, winter shelter, 6-month beds. So that goal was set, that goal was achieved with the new resources, and we see, as a result, a significant increase in the number of people accessing shelter. Here is that data point I referred to earlier about the unique number of individuals served in 2017. Again, as we've increased investments, our ability to serve people has grown as well in a whole range of ways. And this is what I mentioned earlier. This is literally cut and pasted out of one of our service providers' contracts. It's where you see how we're setting accountability outcomes. In this case, this contractor is committing to doing 325 new household placements into permanent housing this year. They're committed to achieving 80% housing retention at 6 months and 70% at 12 months. So with each contractor, depending on the nature of the service, you're going to see these kind of specific outcome targets that we can then also aggregate up in terms of understanding what we can expect to see in terms of performance. This is just the dashboard. It's a quarterly dashboard. They have to put all their data into the system. How many new households in? What are the demographics of those households? Because we not only want to monitor those high-level performance metrics, but also who's being served. For example, are communities of color being equitably served? Are their outcomes as good as the white clients who are being served? So that kind of data comes into the system, and we either pull it ourselves inside the county, or it comes as a direct report from the provider. Sorry, it's so small, but this is in each of the contracts that we put out of the joint office. It has been in the PHB contracts as well. So it's a consistent practice over time. And here's the fiscal accountability piece. So as I mentioned, the IGA spells out our sort of financial accountability measures specifically to PHB. So we have to and do go through both the city and the county budget processes. So we follow the city's budget direction and the county's budget direction, and we go through the briefings that are expected and report to you individually as requested, and also to the full bodies when you meet. We do a reconciliation of our city resources with the Portland Housing Bureau. We get advances, then we do detailed invoices, and reconcile 6 times a year with PHB. And PHB also monitors our expenditures under the IGA for all quarter 2 and quarter 3 data. We do receive some pass-through federal funds from PHB as well, and there we follow all of the fiscal rules and policies and procedures per the IGA and city, county, state, and federal requirements, including auditing, program reporting, monitoring, and grant accounting. So in this year, we were able to provide the budget and financial management to both the city and the county and meet both jurisdictions, often competing deadlines, even as we were trying to get all of these new resources out to the people who need them. And here is a little bit difficult to follow timeline of our budget. It just reflects the complexity of what we are trying to do as a joint office. I'm going to point you first to the orange boxes at the top. So, as we said, the joint office emerged as another step in the implementation of A Home for Everyone, our community-wide initiative to address homelessness. And so while the Home for Everyone committees and coordinating board and executive committee do not sort of dictate the budget of the joint office, we do look to A Home for Everyone for guidance around what our community priorities are, and those then in turn shape the priorities, hopefully, of the city and the county in terms of budgeting. That's certainly how it's looked the last couple of years. So we have a number of subcommittees that meet on a monthly basis: a housing subcommittee, a health, a workforce, a safety off the street shelter committee. The number of people invited to each of those meetings is somewhere between 40 and 90, depending on the committee. That reflects the range of folks who have showed up at those committees. And the starting point is to come to those community-based committees and say, here's the work that we have done over the past year on shelter or on housing placement, review outcomes, look at the best available data, for example, the 2017 point in time data, looking for emerging trends, and to get them to give a first cut at what they would like to see us as a community doing in the area that they've been tasked to work on. From there, you go to the coordinating board with those work group recommendations, and the coordinating board reviews those recommendations, ranks them, and then finalizes a set of recommendations to go up to the executive committee. The coordinating board has 33 members on it. They're appointed, and they are there to represent different perspectives and constituencies in the community that have a stake in the issue of ending homelessness. We have 7 folks on the board right now who either are homeless or have lived experience of homelessness. We have 10 people who identify as people of color. We have 5 culturally specific service providers there. And of the 33, about 13 are contracted with the joint office in some way. So the majority of people there, while they are advocates and providers of various sorts involved in this issue, are not directly funded by the joint office. We have representatives from the police bureau, from the healthcare systems, from the mental health system, mental health advocates. So it's really a diverse group of people who come together around this table once a month or every other month, depending on the time of year. And part of their charge is to take these recommendations and distill them, these budget recommendations, and distill them into recommendations that then come up to the executive committee. And the executive committee includes the mayor and Commissioner Udaley right now. It includes the chair and Commissioner Myron. It also includes the Housing Authority's director, Michael Bonacore. It includes a representative from the Business Alliance, from the faith community, as well as our 2 co-chairs, and a representative from the city of Gresham. And that body then gets to review those high-level recommendations and give direction to the joint office from there. So that process is all happening September through December. And again, it's not at the super specific level. It's much more at the kind of general, these are the right directions. We've seen, for example, in the 2017 point in time count, a significant need within the Native American community. What should we do to help address that?
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you real quick because I have to leave to head out to Troutdale, but I thank you for holding this, and I'm happy to chat later if people have questions.
Thanks, Chair. We appreciate your being here, and good luck today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So coming back to that slide, so as that work is happening, we're also very clear with everybody on A Home for Everyone that we don't know a lot yet about the city and the county budgets in particular. And we're also very clear that this priority and goal setting isn't just about the city and the county budgets, it's actually about the community's goals. And if the city and the county aren't in a position to resource any particular project or objective, that then we can look to other partners in the community to help do that.
Mark, this is, I get dizzy just looking
Yes,
at
I know.
this slide. But I see that in March and April, there's a city and county work session.
Yep.
So last year, we met at the county.
Yep.
This year, we'll meet at the city. I think last year was, we tried it was our first kind of maiden voyage and trying to figure out how to make that work. I would argue that this year, we should come in with our, with the actual proposed budget for the joint office. And in a joint work session, we should take out our pencils and our, and really sharpen our pencils and go through it in some detail with Andrew from our team and the counties and a budget officer from the county, because I think that's where we're going to see whether there's a consensus that that's a right-sized budget, and then also understand some of the trade-offs about what we're going to have to do on both sides of the river. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if the timing works, yes.
And I would say, I think this year, because for a number of reasons, I think it'll be less important just to get thematics about what we do through the joint office, and more to look at the budget and really drill down and figure out what we're buying, how we pay for it, and what the trade-offs are.
All right. So I'm only going to call out one other thing, because everything else on that slide is just the same process that every county department has to go through and every city bureau has to go through. Under the IGA, the joint office puts together its budget and submits it through the Portland Housing Bureau, which incorporates the joint office's requests into its budget. But what you'll see down on the bottom left-hand corner are the Policy and Budget Alignment Committee meetings. So this is the purpose of that PBAC as outlined in the IGA, is as we're going through these sort of budgeting conversations to make sure that the city and the Housing Bureau in particular, and DCHS and the county, as we're working to put together a budget, that the policies and the priorities that are driving that are being coordinated across those departments and the leadership of those departments. So that's the role that PBAC has there, and you see it technically meets quarterly. In this process, it can obviously meet, and the communication can be as frequent as is necessary. And then you'll just see, just for purpose of illustrating, that the city's timeline and the county's timeline around budget don't quite add up or line up, and so our process is a little bifurcated within the joint office, and we're trying to go back and forth and make sure everybody's needs are met in that budgeting.
So if I
process.
could just interject, obviously the Portland Housing Bureau provides housing that's not necessarily linked to the joint office's budget. The county provides social services, which is not there. It would be helpful to me to get an inkling of what else do we spend in our own sides of the river that also contribute, because it's not only what's going into this joint office, there's a number of other things that support this budget.
Yep. Okay. So let me move forward, unless there are questions there, just to give you a quick overview of our current budget. You'll see that on the county general fund side, and I believe it's being blocked out now, but I think those two bars are last year versus this. Yes. Thank you. So you've got 20.6 million in county general fund this year, 26.5 in city general fund. There's the tax title funding on the county side that is also in our budget that needs to go to homeless families. And then we have 6.4 million in federal state funds that come through. So your total budget for the joint office is $58.2 million this year. In terms of where those resources go, this is the breakdown. So you'll see 37%, $21.5 million is going into shelter operations, and that runs the gamut from Kenton Village to the Hanson Building. It's the entire continuum, and it's across populations. So it's domestic violence shelter, it's family shelter, youth shelter operations, and adults, veteran shelter as well.
Yeah, Sharon, could you grab, Director Krieger's mic, thanks, and is the red light on there?
Thank you. I just had a question quickly, since it's down now, but about the permanent supportive housing, and particularly focusing on wraparound services for people with mental health and addictions issues, because I think that is an area where you get the biggest bang for your buck. And I know that along the lines of the questions the mayor was asking, and that we've been talking about outcomes, I'm just curious when and how we start to quantify some of the savings outcomes we might see from those deep investments that we make upfront in things like permanent supportive housing. Because I think that if you invest in those wraparound services for people with mental illness or for people suffering from addictions, you are going to see a huge savings in those services downstream in terms of the revolving door with the jails and people being back on the streets and being in our ERs. So how do we quantify that, or do we have a plan for quantifying that so we can fit that into the equation as we're making some of those decisions?
So we've been able to quantify it for specific projects. So the Bud Clark Commons did a cost analysis, a savings analysis of those folks who went into Bud Clark, their pre and post service utilization, and found significant cost savings. Enterprise just ran a study of different types of supported housing in our community, did the same kind of analysis, found the same kind of outcomes. It's a well-studied question, and so there's a lot of data from around the country as well. The National Alliance to End Homelessness actually maintains a web page that has all of the reports that have looked at this question nationally and documented the savings, and I'm happy to circulate that link to you. So we don't, for the entire inventory of supported housing that we currently have that kind of cost savings analysis, but we know from where we've looked locally and nationally that when we invest in permanent supportive housing, that we will see savings and certainly benefits to the individuals who move into that housing.
So let me build on that theme, because I like where you're going with this. So in a different context, let's say public safety, we can identify people who are frequent users of the public safety system, and you create an alternative track for them focused on them by name. Mm-hmm. Like you have a list of your top 100 users of public safety resources, and then you intervene specific to those top 100 individuals. Now you actually have a side-by-side comparison of what your savings are in real dollars. And I'm wondering why we don't do this.
There's the service coordination team.
Okay, so where do we get that list, and where do we see that data and information and the outcomes posted? Because that, I think, makes the case.
Well, but that was an initiative started by Commissioner Leonard, and additionally there were people with multiple petty crimes who were getting those services. As time went by, they actually went away from the list.
I'm talking about on the, I'm sorry, I shifted back to the homelessness question.
That's what we're both talking about, same thing. Putting people with, especially with dual diagnosis, mental illness and drug and alcohol, doing a lot of property crimes to support that. As I said, they did have a list which the Mercury and others called the secret list, which was of concern. My understanding, at least when I last checked in, is that it's been working so well to get the people who were 10 years ago, the users of the service are now back into being tax-paying productive citizens, and that they don't have that list anymore. With the mobile service teams, we also, which is the Project Respond police officer mobile units, they are responsible for kind of guiding people that they see on the streets into those programs.
Is there a HIPAA issue there, or is there some reason why
there are
we
a
don't
variety
do
of
that?
So there are a variety of data sharing challenges, but they can be overcome. Okay. So one of the pieces of work we're doing right now in the context of chronic homelessness and supported housing is working with CSH, this national consulting firm that has done this in other cities. They call it FUSE. Don't ask me what the acronym stands for. But the point is to work with the health system and the criminal justice system and the homeless system to look for those people who are chronically homeless and are also high utilizers in the healthcare system and high utilizers in the criminal justice system, and to identify those people by name and then to prioritize our supported housing resources to that population.
And so just so I'm clear, because Commissioner Fritz is telling me that we have done this, or we do this. Do we do this, or?
No, so we do service coordination team.
Right.
What I heard was that it's the same concept. It's how service coordination team got off the ground. It was the same motivating thought, right? That you have a group of people who are using a disproportionate number of the resources, and if you just target interventions, service interventions to them, they will come out better, and the system will save resources. We have not been able yet to fuse this chronic homelessness integration with health and criminal justice, but it is something we're talking to both the health department and criminal justice folks about with CSH's help. So I would expect, as we move forward, trying to address the growth in chronic homelessness in our community and wanting to expand permanent supportive housing, that we're targeting that resource through a mechanism just like the one you're describing. Our open data system
That's helpful. Thank
and
you.
work with PHB and the county around data sharing is a precursor
Okay,
to being able to do
and that's
that.
good to know, because Commissioner Fritz is telling me we already have this model that we could build from.
We do, and also it's a really good time to be looking at how effective is it and how much is it needed now, and should the city be funding it or doing it? Because, as you remember, Mayor, we were going to use the cannabis tax money for that program. Instead, much of it is now one-time funded from the general fund.
Right.
And so we do need to look at, is this something that we should consider, and if so, should it be the city doing it, the county, the joint office?
I want to just raise one cautionary flag here, because this is very important. And I applaud Commissioner Myron for raising this question of permanent supportive housing, because I do think it's the missing piece. I think it is the piece that both the county and the city have to focus on in September and October. I do think we need to put down a very clear marker in terms of what our 10-year goal is. The reason I believe permanent supportive housing needs to be funded is that it has tremendous outcomes for people who are facing the most barriers on our street, most likely to die, where we're spending a fortune treating people in the most inadequate setting. We have a chance to transform lives, and we know it works. And in fact, there's nothing radical about this. This is a tantamount to old wine in a new bottle. We know it works. But here's the problem. There will be those who say that permanent supportive housing also is important because over time we can show savings of some kind. And I've been in this job long enough to know that every time we start saying that there's potentially some savings because we're going to people that are consuming a lot of resources, and hopefully that if we stabilize them, it'll free up other resources, what we find is that fate or history intervenes. The 10-year plan to end homelessness was based on the premise that if we target the hardest to house, the most expensive, the most burdened people on our streets, we would have all these other resources for everyone else. Well, no one contemplated the worst recession in our lifetime. No one contemplated the federal government beginning to walk away from its housing commitments. And when the Berlin Wall fell, we were all giddy about all the savings from no longer being in wars all over the place, and that peace dividend was going to be spent. I don't know what happened to that peace dividend. When the Affordable Care Act promised through Medicaid expansion the prospect of stabilizing people and having some additional resources, it really didn't materialize. So I just want to go back with a cautionary flag. I believe permanent supportive housing is the missing piece. I think it is the most effective strategy for dealing with now the hardest to house population that's on our streets. I think it has been demonstrated beyond doubt that it is the right approach. But it was in the short term, it's going to require more investment. And since we don't control the economy, the timing of things, all the other factors, again, the spigot issues, we know it's going to help people live better lives. What we don't know is whether it's going to free up additional resources down the road. We just can't count on that.
All right, so I'll just, you can see here where placement and retention is the next biggest investment that we make, and then it's disappeared again. And then we go down, there's the supportive housing, so we do make some significant investments of general fund in various forms of supported housing now. Our administration, that's the joint offices, admin is the 4% there. Diversion is what I described earlier, a variety of interventions to keep people from becoming homeless in the first place. We make a significant general fund investment in employment is mostly about bridging the gap to mainstream employment resources, right? So closing that gap to make sure people experiencing homelessness are getting the employment supports that they need. And then system coordination, information referral, think 211, and those kinds of resources.
Just want to call out the 4% at admin. That's phenomenal. I mean, it's really a lot of work that you and your staff are doing, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, and that is the end of my piece.
Very good.
Andrew, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mark.
Keyboard. I will drive through the next portion.
Thanks, Mark. That was an excellent presentation. Appreciate it very much.
So Andrew Scott, City Budget Director, and I'm going to spend a few minutes walking through some city financial context slides as we have this conversation about where we're headed on the joint office. I just wanted to provide a little bit of that context about some of the things the city's facing right now and in the future, and the history of joint office funding. And I'm going to talk about the general fund overall, some of those financial risks, the homeless services funding, and then a little bit about trade-offs that we might be looking at over the next year or two. So the slide on page 18, this shows, there we go. This is our 5-year general fund discretionary slide. And, you know, we still find ourselves in a period of remarkable growth. And I think it's worth just continuing to come back to that and really understand that that this period seems unprecedented. Perhaps if we go back 100 years, there were rapid periods in Portland history, but this really is a remarkable growth. And you can see the general fund over the last, the 4 years of growth in our city general fund has gone from $418 million total to over $521 million, which is 25% growth in that 4-year period of time. That growth was fueled in large part by our business license tax. That accounts for about $37 million of that total growth. And our transit lodging tax accounts for about $10 million of that total growth. Property tax also accounts for roughly half, maybe a little bit less. But I think it's really worth noting that half of that growth has come from our two most volatile revenue sources, so our business license tax and our transit lodging tax. And so as you hear from our city economist, and you'll hear from us again in our October work session, we would expect during the next slowdown to see a significant decline in those resources. If past history is any account, those are our two revenue sources that decline significantly in slowdowns, and they have fueled a huge portion of
And
this
Andrew,
growth
you are
going forward.
predicting a slowdown over the next how many years?
We are not predicting a slowdown, but we do expect a slowdown in the next few years.
Yeah. Just anecdotally, my son has demanded a new teenager's bedroom, so I took him on a father-son trip to IKEA over the weekend, and I do not exaggerate when I tell you that I could not find a parking spot at Cascade Station, and the place was mobbed, and that's just one little bellwether of what's happening with our economy, but it's just extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, and we continue to look for signs of slowdown. There are signs in other areas of the country, and in a few slides I was also going to mention, you know, it's hard to know the storms and the impact that Harvey and, you know, potentially Irma will have on the economy, both short term and long term. But there are slowdowns other places, but not here. And so I think we continue to really benefit from this intense period of economic growth. This slide on slide 19 shows what's happened over the last 4 years. So as we've had this large increase in the general fund, just to remind council about where they have made investments with that new money. So I mentioned that the general fund's gone up by about $100 million. About $45 million of that is what we would consider new spending or expansions of programs. The rest of the increase, the other $55 million, has gone to sort of existing salary, benefits, PERS increases, other inflationary adjustments. So over half of that increase really has just gone to maintain current service level. But about $45 million is new spending. And what we tried to break out here over the last few years is where that funding has gone. I do want to note there was a slightly different starting point on this, just from some data issues in terms of pulling the information from our budget system. So this really is just fiscal year 2015 through 18. The last slide showed fiscal year 14 through 18. So just for those tracking that closely. But you can see parks, police, and housing. And within housing, most of that investment was in the homeless services, were the largest council investments over the last few years. Smaller investments in fire, in the Portland building, the Office of Neighborhood Involvement, and the Bureau of Emergency Communications. All other bureaus in the city combined actually saw a small net reduction of just about $100,000. So some of those bureaus saw increases, some saw decreases, but combined they were roughly flat, not including current service level, but in terms of additional investments.
Commissioner Fritz will be handling all of my budget negotiations this year.
I do want to point out this is also just the ongoing investment, so this doesn't include one-time resources, which add significant millions to some of those bureaus. I mentioned just a minute ago, but talking about future financial risks, I think it's fair to say that the growth in general fund discretionary has been unprecedented. And yet, those of you who've been through those budgets know that we've still taken some significant cuts to city programs. Even, I'm going to put this in quotes, even winners, such as the Parks Bureau, have had to make some significant cuts as well. Closing Buckman Pool, backfilling our preschool program with one-time dollars. The Police Bureau, which also had some significant investments, also had to cut Mounted Patrol and other programs. And other bureaus not included in those have made significant reductions over the last few years. And then there are...
May I just interrupt because to explain some of the parks increases because of the arbitration with the labour unions, and that we've created a lot more ongoing positions within the union rather than using seasonal. So that's a policy choice that council made, which needs to be factored in.
Correct. Yeah, and some of that, the parks increase was also through operations and maintenance funding for the new parks that have been part of the city's plan and expansion as well. But I want to remind council of the short and medium term financial risks that we are facing. Labor contract costs, continue to be a financial risk, and that current bargaining is going to significantly impact our future financial flexibility. Last week, council approved contracts that are going to add about $2 million to the general fund and about $11 million overall in additional salaries and benefits. And so right now, with just the approved contracts, the first $2 million of any surplus in next year will go to those contracts. And we expect some additional costs as we continue negotiating the remaining contracts as well. Potential slow economic growth, it's likely going to be good through the end of 2017-18. There is weakness in parts of the U.S. and Asia, and as I mentioned, some uncertainty about the economic impact from the storms that have hit the United States, the southern United States. Federal policy continues to be and pose a potential fiscal threat to the city. Debt ceiling negotiations, regulatory reforms, potential cuts to the low-income heating assistance program it has a huge impact on these people who are cost burdened that we mentioned already. And then finally, other city obligations, which we'll continue to come back and remind you about with harbor restoration and the Columbia River levy, et cetera. So just things to keep in mind as we have this conversation. I won't spend too much time on these next two slides because Mark went through these and we've talked about it. But just this is the slide that shows the city's investment in homeless services funding over the last few years. As the mayor mentioned earlier in this work session, it has increased by about 165% over 5 years, and $9.6 million growth in ongoing funding within a significant investment of one-time dollars over the last 3 years as well. Questions about that slide? I don't want to go too quickly through these, but and then the next, this is a little bit more of a breakdown of that $26.5 million. I think council's familiar with this, but just as a reminder, there was about $11.8 million of existing ongoing. We made a current appropriation level target increase of $3.5 million. We also shifted some of the ongoing permanent supportive housing funding from the Housing Bureau over to the Joint Office. In addition, there was an $8.7 million one-time investment of one-time funding in the Joint Office, and then they underspent last year's budget by about $750,000, and we carried that over to help fund some of the current year services as well.
So let me tee up your next couple of slides, and I'll just put it out there, and I've put this out there before, and I put this out there when we were coming up with this additional one-time funding. This is not sustainable over the long term, and that's my concern. And as somebody had raised the question, could we, prior to getting to the table, prior to the chair releasing her initial budget, prior to me releasing my initial budget, could we as a council come to a consensus on what the total outlay is that we think is sustainable, both for this year and into the future? And what I'm understanding, Andrew, is the economy is still, I won't say on fire anymore because that's no longer an apt analogy, but the economy is rolling along very nicely. And we have resources this year, but in out years, we've got long tail liabilities that are going to start to encroach on our ability to be able to fund this office, even at the level it is currently funded. And you've mentioned some of the out year risks, labor negotiations, PERS, other things that are coming our way. So that sort of gets to the meat of the conversation I need to have with my colleagues as we enter into these early conversations with the Joint Office and the committee and just have a realistic setting of the table in terms of what we can provide and over what time frame we can actually provide those resources.
Yeah, and that's what slides 23 and 24 really are intended. They are not by any means a proposal of what the trade-off would be, but it's just to sort of say if we were to convert the one-time that is funding the current service level in the joint office, to ongoing, it would require about a 1.9% cut if we did across-the-board cuts in every city bureau. Now, we don't generally do across-the-board cuts in the end, nor is it good budget policy, and so not saying we would cut police and fire and parks and other bureaus at that amount, but just to give an illustration of what those dollar amounts would be, at that 1.9%.
I appreciate the value of this chart, but this is before we actually have determined what our ongoing and one-time money will be available for the budget season.
That's correct,
So this
Commissioner, yeah.
assumes a status quo year.
That's right. It assumes a status quo, and I guess just getting back, we will be coming out with a forecast in December. We'll give you an update at your work session in about a month in terms of where we are. We'll come out with a forecast in December, and that forecast, very likely will have some surplus dollars. I do want to stress, though, Council has already committed some of those surplus dollars to labor contracts and a few other small things as well, but we'll have a fuller picture in the next couple of months. And then slide 24 is the same information, just sort of noting, the current, in city parlance, this is different than the county, but we talk about current appropriation levels. The current appropriation level for the joint office of ongoing general fund is $17.1 million. That number will increase by inflation when we go into fiscal year 2018-19. But then any increases above that are when we begin to talk about trade-offs, again, as Commissioner Fish noted, depending on the forecast, surpluses, et cetera. So again, just to provide some of that context. And really just to summarize, and turn it back over to the mayor and council, for conversation, we have a number of expensive priorities and obligations. And as usual, the city doesn't have enough revenue to fund all of them. And so I think that really is the conversation that, and this is really the first of a number of difficult conversations we're going to have going into the 18-19 budget.
I'm not sure I understand this slide. Could you explain it?
The very last one
fiscal
here.
trade-offs.
Yeah, this is just noting, so as on the previous slide, that right column says if we increase the joint office current appropriation level target by $9.4 million, that's the 1.9%.
And I'm sorry, where did you get reduction 0.4?
That is the current one-time funding for the joint office. So again, so 17.1 million is the existing target going into 18-19. The middle column is just to say if we increased it by 4.7, so it's halfway to the current level of funding. Those are sort of the reductions, and then if we increased it by the 9.4 million, which would be maintaining the current service level within the joint
So
office.
these are, for example, using basically your largest general fund bureaus.
Yeah, we're just we're showing again with that 1 point. It would be either a little bit under a 1% or a 1.9% reduction at these two scenarios. Council obviously can be anywhere on this range, but we just wanted to provide that range.
Okay, thank you.
We also last week had a discussion led by the mayor on the Build Portland initiative, which included that proposes not taking all of the money we captured from urban renewal districts. I had the thought at that time that the county will also be getting a lot of money coming back onto the tax rolls because of the ending of urban renewal districts, and so I think that has to be part of the conversation too.
You're almost finished?
I am finished.
So Andrew, a couple of questions, and thank you for an excellent presentation. Back in 2012, the council had a similar dilemma in that $4.5 million of money that we were investing in homelessness programs was one-time money. We made a decision to convert it to ongoing and then sort of figure out how to pay for it in the budget process to follow. Could you just remind us about what our approach was then and how we ended up covering that cost?
Yeah, so the approach in that year Council looked at one-time funding that was going to the Housing Bureau and wanted to convert that to ongoing. At the same time, they wanted to convert ongoing funding or one-time funding that was going to Prosper Portland, and also to, I believe it was the Office of Neighborhood Involvement. There was a small piece as well. And so Council made the decision in the fall to fold all of those one-time commitments to increase the CAL targets for those bureaus. And then what that does is, from a forecast perspective, we then take that increased cost into account, and then we report to council what the available resources are. At the same time, not council's doing, but a library district was formed, which took about $10 million out of our general fund. And so all of those decisions sort of combine, and overall, economy, we faced about a $20 million reduction going into the 13-14 budget. And so I can't say specifically what was the trade-offs for that $4.5 million, because it was all part of that overall budget conversation. But all of those pieces council looked at and said, these are priorities, and we want to fund these, and then we're going to spread that cost out and go through a budget process to deal with it.
So let me take this moment just to preview 3 or 4 approaches that I hope you'll walk us through when we get our first forecast, and we start really talking about how we manage this challenge. And I want to make sure that I've got all the options on the table. And this is not, I'm not advocating, I just want to make sure I understand the menu of choices we're going to have. Option number 1 would be to prioritize converting 9.4 million to ongoing. And that assumes that we think 26.5 is the right number. It assumes that we think the city and county mix is the right number, and it assumes that the council is satisfied we're getting full value for the investment. And that I think there's a lot of work to do before we get to that point. But option 1, it seems to me, is we make a commitment to convert 9.4 to ongoing. Option 2, and these are not in any order, is to take some portion of the 9.4, as we've done in the past, make a down payment, and then backfill whatever we think is the rest that honors a combined investment to get the job done at the joint office with one-time money. Now, the mayor has said for him a touchstone is a sustainable funding. I agree with that. I also think, though, that in an emergency, sometimes color of money in the short term is less important. That is, if we're being honest and transparent, that it may not be something we can sustain forever. If in any one year we can cobble together one time and ongoing, I think for an emergency need like this, I think there's an argument to do that, while also signaling that it may not be quote unquote sustainable. Number 3 is to consider the question somewhat differently, which is, what's the right number? So not being constrained by sort of looking at ongoing, one time, and the like, but is asking this broader system question: what's the right number? And option 4 is you giving us some additional choices other than these scary cuts that you have in one of your charts about all of our favorite general fund bureaus. And by that I mean, what I have observed over the last 9 years is that when something becomes a fundamental council priority, we start getting very creative about how we fund it. And Commissioner Fritz has mentioned we've got some open questions about what we do with marijuana tax money. Now, a little bit of that is, moving the deck chairs around, but we get to decide that question. What is the marijuana money fund? There is an open question. I'm not opening this up to open an old wound, but we've never really resolved the question of what happens with the CEO tax. Maybe that's because Congress never really resolved the question whether we could ever calculate it. But so you get the drift. What I will be looking for from you is, what are those other pots of money that the city could potentially tap if it wanted to make an investment in sustainable funding for the joint office, and or if it wanted to boost its investment in permanent supportive housing? Because at the end of the day, we're going to have to find some new service dollars. And the final thing I hope we have a chance to discuss this fall, probably informally first, is what are some additional revenue sources that could do it? Again, over the last 9 years, we've heard lots of interesting ideas, from cell phone equity to healthy initiatives around around soda and sugar and the various things. And I don't know where any of them stand. I sometimes worry about I worry a lot about the cumulative burden of all these things, and I think we have to be very strategic. But is there potentially another revenue source that, when pitched to the public as a source where the money is dedicated to this compelling need, actually we end up finding broader support? So what did I miss?
No, actually, you have outlined, as well as I could, of the options. The only, I do want to stress, all the general fund bureaus are my favorite. So these are just the three largest general fund bureaus.
I know,
So
but
that's why that's the sole reason why they showed up on the
I
list.
took an extra Tums when I saw that chart. Point well made. But so those are all the things I'm hoping that you'll come back to us with as you guide us through the options. But I agree with the mayor that it begins with a fundamental question about what should be our level of commitment, what's the value we're getting, what's that number? Because once the council settles on a number, we've shown in the past we can be pretty creative about funding that number.
And just as a follow, it sounds like, just to confirm, one of the things you would like us to do is develop some of those other options. And I think we have a work session on October 17th to talk about the 18-19 budget. And I'd be happy to come back with more information on
Please.
some alternative
Please.
sources as well.
Good. We got through it. 9 minutes to spare. Any further thoughts or questions? Just to summarize, I'm hearing a strong interest in us participating, having the city council participate in the process that leads to the joint office decision-making, and I think that's entirely appropriate. This question, obviously, of sustainability and what the right level is, I think Commissioner Fish did a great job of framing the question. Unspoken but obvious in all of this is the level of importance of this particular issue relative to other important things that the city needs to fund that are also important issues. And so that's just a trade-off we need to make during our budget session. I think I'll end it right there, except saying I don't think the current service level is sacrosanct. We stretched really, really hard during the last budget process to get to where we thought we were in a good, honorable partnership with the county. But now the target is very, very high for us to be able to continue to maintain it. And I hate to continue to be the wet blanket, but at the end of the day, we have to balance the budget. So that's it. Without further ado, we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Mark, thank you. Excellent presentation. Andrew, thank you. Chair Kafori in absentia, thank you for being here. Commissioner Myron, we're greatly appreciative of you being here. Shannon, as always, well.